thought about peptides. Are they worth it? Is it real deal? Is there clinical evidence? Can they be helpful? Are you wasting your money? Like, what's the deal? Oral peptides, is that even a thing? Can the body even absorb that? What is the deal with peptides? Well, we're going to get into it in this show today. I've got lots of data. I promise to share relevant data, not bore you, because this stuff is actually very exciting. In fact, I think all of you are very familiar with a couple of peptides that have been around for a while. In fact, there's a peptide out there that my daughter uses each and every day. You guys have probably heard of it. It's called insulin, right? It's one of the original peptides that was discovered over 100 years ago, and it's been used in humans to help those with diabetes, especially type 1 diabetes like my daughter, and it's life-saving. So stinking important and helpful. In fact, I believe they've been using it in humans since 1921. So 103 years worth of data on insulin. And insulin is a peptide. What the heck is a peptide? A peptide is basically just a short, or I should say a small protein, right? A peptide is a small protein. And to kind of give you a specific definition, typically, as you know, proteins are made up of smaller groups called amino acids. They're linked together, and a couple of these linked together is a peptide, right? Just take two of them. You latch them together, right, with these things called chemical molecular bonds. You latch them together with these bonds, and boom, you have two amino acids together, makes a peptide. And typically up to about 100 amino acids or less is considered a peptide, and 100 or greater, we sort of arbitrarily say that's a protein because it's a little bit bigger. Just to give you an example, this famous, very well-known peptide, insulin, right, that our body makes, hopefully, in those beta cells of the pancreas, is 51 amino acids. So it's kind of in that middle of the road, mid-range peptide, and it's been available, like I said, for over 100 years, which is amazing. And what's interesting about this particular peptide, insulin, is, of course, it mimics the body's own naturally occurring peptide, right? The insulin that the pancreas makes. And they initially got it from animals, right? And then they were able to make it in a recombinant DNA fashion, which is in the lab, identically to the human insulin, which is what my daughter takes. She takes this peptide, which is insulin, and we have to inject her each and every day, every time she eats. And it's been life-changing. It's been life-saving. It's been amazing. But it's injectable, right? You inject it into her. You got to use a small needle. And those typically are the peptides that we have studied over the years, right? More recently, you are familiar, I'm sure, with the GLP-1 agonists. I did many podcasts on them in the last year or so, so go back and re-listen. Lots of cool information. GLP-1 agonists, glucagon-like peptide agonists, like you've heard of them, right? You've heard of them, Ozempic, Mounjaro. They're out there, they're used, and many have been used for over a decade or more for diabetes of the type 2 fashion, typically type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance. This is what they were designed for. And now many are using them for other things, like let's just lose some weight, right? And if you want to get into the nitty gritty and into the weeds, listen to my former podcast, but that is another very well-known familiar peptide that many of us have heard of, the GLP-1 agonist, also predominantly used in the injectable form, right? Because that's the way they've been studied. That's the way they've been shown to be more effective over the years, because they get right into the tissues, right? In the bloodstream, the tissues, they don't have to go through that significant degradation that happens in the gut or the intestinal tract, if you will, that could be potentially breaking down these things. They do have one version of basically Ozempic that is oral, but guess what? It's not that popular. It doesn't work as well. I mean, you would think it would be the most popular because people wouldn't have to inject themselves, right? They just take a pill. Well, think about it. Peptides have been studied for over 100 years. The biggest, I would say, breakthrough occurred with insulin, right? 1921-ish became available. And insulin has been used primarily in an injectable form, right? They actually have tried some oral versions. In fact, there's been some promising recent data, like after 100 years worth of trying this thing orally, they found we don't really have big human trials yet, but in dogs recently that they have a pretty, effective dose of a long-acting, kind of like a Lantus or Glargine long-acting insulin orally, which may be available in the future. But check this out. We've had over 100 years of familiarity with peptides like insulin, this one in particular, and we still really don't have a mainstream oral insulin available. Like I would know, right? I would prefer to just give my daughter an insulin, tablet, supplement, whatever, if that were available. So I wouldn't have to poke her 6 to 8 times a day to give her insulin. But that hasn't really been available, which is interesting. And so now we're getting bombarded, right, by all these supplement companies or influencers in the nutrition and wellness space, like get this peptide, that peptide. And I would say that in recent months, maybe even in years, a lot of these have been marketed to be taken in orally, which I'm just going to be honest. I just did a PubMed review, and a plus one, looked through all the data that's available right now, and there really is not much data showing efficacy for oral peptide use, taking them in the form of an oral whatever, supplement, capsule, pill, what have you. Just not a lot of data there. And like I mentioned, we really only have two that are available in the oral form. There's a few others. There's some cancer ones and things like that, but there's literally less than 50 available in the oral form for treatment of really significant diseases, whether it be cancer or other blood dyscrasias, things like that. And they have had significant research, significant efforts to make them bioavailable. And by and large, there's just not a lot of great data on oral peptide use. And we'll get into why that is. But I just want to, since traditionally these peptides that have been used for human use have been injected, like insulin, for example, or more recently Ozempic, Mounjaro, Wegovy. Traditionally, these have been injected because they just are more effective. They get into the bodily systems, if you will, the bloodstream, et cetera, to be able to be used in a much more efficient way than if you were to eat them or swallow them or what have you, take them down your GI tract. And so I just wanted to quickly go over a couple of the more well-known injectable peptides because they've been studied for years. These are things like BPC 157. And I personally, I'm thinking about using this in myself. I have an old injury of my elbow that never really healed properly. This is a great one to be used in injection form at the site of an injury, whether it be a tendinous injury, you could have an articular or joint injury, say like a labral tear in the shoulder, things like that. These have been used for a couple of decades already and with great success. And so this is BPC 157, but this once again would be administered by your practitioner in the office in the form of a needle in an injection, preferably at the site of wherever that injury was. It'll work a little better. It could work just in the subcutaneous tissue elsewhere, but typically I've seen better results in the actual area of the tear, say a tendinous tear, for example. So that's BPC 157. There's this other one that's actually pretty commonplace. Many have heard of it, TA1 or thymosin alpha 1, which is kind of a general peptide used for healing and a lot of uses, whether it be in a cancer scenario, or some people just take this a couple of times a year to improve immune function. The thymosin part, thymosin alpha 1, it comes from the thymus, right? The thymus is one of our most important immune tissues, the thymus. So thymosin alpha 1 has been used for many years to help improve immune function. Once again, this is injectable, right? This is not something you're just taking orally. There's a few others that I'm familiar with that I like that I think can have some pretty significant utility. Another one is epithalin, which they actually have it now in a spray, which is showing some potential promise. Traditionally, it's been used in the form of an injection. It's kind of an anti-aging peptide, if you will, epithalin. That's Epitalon. That's another one I'm familiar with. There's another one that's available recently called PT141. It's an injection as well. You're kind of hearing a little bit of a theme, right? These are peptides that are injected because traditionally this is the most effective route, injectable, right? I'm not saying that we couldn't have oral peptides that could be effective, but you're going to see, I'm going to share some research with you. We're just not quite there yet. And if anybody tells you differently, honestly, they're just not familiar with the data that's out there. So hate to break it to you, but hate to spoil that. Spoiler alert, right? The oral peptides, not a lot of data, not a lot of efficacy with respect to the published data on the oral peptide. So most of the ones that have been used effectively over the last several decades, which are getting more common in the longevity space, the health and wellness, the performance space, like the ones I mentioned already, alpha-thymosin 1, BPC 157, as well as epithalin, for example. PT141, which is being used now to help with libido, for example, also an injection. There's a few others for mitochondrial health that I'm familiar with, which can be used as well. SS31, MOTS-C, that's MOTSC. These are also injected primarily. They're starting to try these in nasal sprays in some of the examples. Like I said, the epithalin came out of Russia, St. Petersburg, by a really bright physician, a doctor over there, Khavison, Khavison. So anything that refers to this epithalin, make sure you read his stuff. He's kind of the OG of this particular peptide. But what I really wanted to share with you, not so much get too deep into the weeds of these peptides that I just shared, which are basically all injectable peptides from the very well-known ones like insulin. And we said that was a 51 amino acid peptide. And these others that are getting really common, like the GLP-1 agonists, which are peptides, and they're primarily used in the injectable form. Right now, there's a lot of hype about oral peptide therapy. And I'm going to share with you some data because there have been a couple of, I think, pretty helpful reviews written in the last couple of years. One is from Theranostics in 2022. That's Theranostics 2022, 12-3, pages 1419 to 1439. And it's called Oral Delivery of Protein and Peptide Drugs, from nonspecific formulation approaches to intestinal cell targeting strategies. And it's a super interesting article. Oh my gosh, I read the entire thing because I was just fascinated with it. And it wasn't too bad. It's about 20 pages. So if you got a little bit of free time, you can email me, message me on Insta, what have you. I'll share this with you. Theranostics 2022, Oral Delivery of Protein and Peptide Drugs. What was interesting is this is just 2 years ago, 2022, and still yet, despite all this hype on social media, all these supplement companies popping up here and there and everywhere that are marketing these oral peptides, there's just not a lot of data out there showing their efficacy, their utility. This route is really challenging, as you might expect, right? Because if you take something orally, there's going to have a lot of difficulty for that getting to where it needs to go in a way that is still usable, that it hasn't been broken down to a point where it can't act on the receptor that it's supposed to bind to, for example. And so most of them are just not that effective. In fact, I'll read a little bit to you here. It says, obviously, the most commonly employed method to give these peptides is either IV or an injection like subcutaneous, for example, because that is shown to be more effective. However, they say oral delivery is promising, but it's hindered, right? Hindered by the harsh oral delivery systems. It's been a persistent challenge. It talks all about everything from the degradation, which can start by your salivary enzymes right there in the mouth, of course, into the stomach, where you have very strong digestive enzymes. You have a very low or acidic pH. Then you have more enzymes in the small intestine, which can really wreak havoc on these peptides, break them down to the point where they're just small amino acids, and they probably won't be able to work in the way that you would want them to work because they're specific. It's kind of like if you think about a receptor where you have a specific, in this case, a peptide that binds to it, it has to fit a special three-dimensional shape. It's like a Lego piece that only goes in one certain way at one certain area, and it's got to fit basically near identically to that receptor site, or it's just not going to work. And so if you swallow these things and they get broken down, you can imagine that changes the configuration, the 3D appearance of a peptide, and most likely it's not going to be able to get to that site. And maybe you don't break down 100%, so maybe a small amount will be active, but so far this has been a very challenging scenario to have an effective oral peptide. That's just how it goes, right? We first discovered these things way back in early 1920s, right? With insulin coming from both the cows and the dogs, the canine and bovine pancreatic insulin. Then we were able to start to synthesize these and make them ourselves back in the That was around 1960s or so, maybe 1970s. By the 1980s, we were able to make our own human recombinant insulin in the lab, like the exact same peptide insulin, the 51 amino acid sequence. We could make that in the lab, identical to the human insulin, big giant breakthrough. And then since then, honestly, there's less than 50 of these that are being used in very common practice right now for a lot of medical things. Right now, the ones that we're familiar with in the body, there's really not that many, like I said, that are being used regularly. I think there's around 300,000 is kind of the readings that I was looking at, peptides in our body that could be potentially targeted, 300,000, but there are very few, only several dozen that are commercially available. There's really not a lot of them. And I just mentioned probably the top 6 that I'm familiar with, only a half dozen, which are kind of being used pretty regularly. So yeah, it's a pretty small number of these things that are still being able to be used. It says, according to this review, that there's about 240 in total that have been approved. A lot of them still in clinical trials. But it's been challenging. Most of these are for injected use, right? Injectable use. And so it's crazy. It is so crazy. People are talking about, oh, this supplement company is coming out with, these peptides, which are super awesome for performance, longevity, all these things. And obviously they're an oral supplement. And so although maybe they come from hopefully a natural source, and maybe in nature they can be very helpful. And the good thing about peptides is they tend to be, generally speaking, pretty safe, right? It's just eating a small protein in general, right? They tend to be pretty safe. So there's not a lot of downside, right? Unless, it's just super expensive and you happen to be wasting your money, but there's not a lot of downside really because they're pretty safe. And so the ones that have been available in an oral source over the years that have been studied in the lab, et cetera, they have to do all these crazy modifications to them, whether it be putting them in liposomes, making them hydrophobic, putting like a lipid membrane around them, all these techniques. You can form cations on the surface that makes them be able to be more permeable. That's a positive charge, if you will. You can do what's called pegylation. You can make them into prodrugs. You can do all kinds of crazy stuff. There's actually this really crazy, and I'll just share it because I hadn't even heard of this, but this is nutty. This is basically, they make them penetrate the actual lining of the GI tract in like this micro needle form. Like it's crazy. It's insane. I hadn't even heard of that. I've heard of all these other ones, the cations, the liposomal formulations, these kinds of things, but it's basically a microscopic medical device. It's called a biodegradable micro needle based delivery system. It's crazy stuff. Like they are trying so hard to make these things orally available to the point where they're manufacturing this tiny little needle injector. It's called the LUMI, the luminal unfolding microneedle injector. So it's kind of folded up when you swallow it in this capsule. In the GI tract, the thing opens up and it literally has all these tiny needles in it. It's kind of like, think of a small piece of Velcro, but with little needles poking out, and it sticks to the lining of the cells. And these needles are small enough that they can penetrate the membrane, but not be so big that they penetrate the whole cell and get into the bloodstream and cause all kinds of issues with potential infections and getting other things into the bloodstream and things like that. It's crazy stuff. It's the luminal unfolding microneedle injector, LUMI, and they're trying to find all these ways to be able to make oral or a peptide that you eat, that you swallow, bioavailable. So this is still up and coming. It's not ready for prime time. They have these crazy techniques, the intestinal mucoadhesive patches, the microneedles, all kinds of crazy stuff. This thing called the transient permeation enhancer, or TPE. I mean, there's just crazy stuff that is being designed right now. But I'm going to just say right now, present day 2024, orally taken, right, taken by mouth, peptides, for the most part, don't have a lot of data behind them as far as having a high efficacy, bioavailability. For the most part, there's just not great data to show that. So if somebody's telling you, hey, go out and buy this new supplement, this new thing, it has all these super amazing, superhuman peptides or enhance your performance, longevity, blah, blah, blah. I mean, they could, but I'm just going to say the data is not great. So, and traditionally, like I mentioned from the outset, we have been studying peptides now for over 100 years. And the OG peptide, insulin, you can imagine how much studying has occurred with this single 51 amino acid insulin over the years. And still yet in 2024, we do not have an equally effective bioavailable oral dose of insulin available to the common public. We just don't. And we've been studying this thing for over 100 years. So, like I said, when you hear about all these companies popping up trying to sell you whatever their peptide is that they say is a super bioenhancing, longevity focusing, performance, whatever they're telling you, and it's an oral peptide, I'm just going to say, maybe for now, just save your money. I think this technology is up and coming, that there will be a day, and I really hope and pray for that day that we can have better, more bioavailable peptides available that you can take orally. But I don't think that time has come yet. I'm going to save my money. I'm not going to be buying a bunch of these oral peptides because the data is just not there. It's just not there, and they can be super expensive. However, with the caveat, there are well-studied injectable peptides, right? Like, of course, insulin has been available for 100 years. And then the more, new kid on the blocks that aren't really that new kid on the block. I mean, shout out to one of my junior high bands that was out there in the time, new kids. But like the BPC 157s, the thymosin alpha A, the epithalin, for example, the PT 141, the MOTS-C and the SS31 that I'm familiar with, those are injectable. So they are more bioavailable. They have benefits. I'm not going to say any of those are great for everyday use. You don't want to be doing this kind of thing every day for a couple of reasons. One, your body kind of gets used to it. You have this thing called tachyphylaxis, which is basically it's just not as effective if you keep injecting it every single day. So there's certain sort of schemes, if you will, where every 6 months or every so often you can do these kinds of things. They still tend to be fairly expensive, but at least they've been shown to be a little bit more effective because they're in the more bioavailable form that you just inject into the tissues. Like I said, if you have a injury like a tendon or whatnot, that BPC 157 could potentially help you. So talk to your doctor or provider who's very familiar with these kinds of technologies, and because it may just help you. Maybe there's actually some studies right now happening to look at head-to-head whether injecting these kinds of things like the BPC 157 could potentially prevent a major operative corrective procedure, maybe a shoulder surgery or some kind of other surgery, knee surgery, for example. They're one of the most common orthopedic procedures done nowadays. But they're finally studying these things head to head to see if potentially you could avoid surgery in some of these cases. There's also cool stuff. You guys have heard of it, stem cells and things like that. Also super cool stuff to be able to have the opportunity to inject into a joint, etc. This is pretty cutting edge rejuvenative medicine type of stuff that maybe not everybody has the ability to be exposed to or to use or utilize. I'm actually looking at hoping to be able to use some of these for myself. I have some injuries that I haven't fully healed from, as well as I'm just not getting any younger, right? I'm in my 50s now, and so it's exciting stuff. But I'm just going to say that there is so much we can do, right? That's not expensive, that doesn't involve these kinds of injections or buying a bunch of oral peptide supplements, which I'm just going to say once again, for right now, I'm not going to waste my money. I'm not going to spend it that way because there's just not a lot of data to support that. So I hope this podcast has at least been helpful in that respect. There's very promising, I think, potential technology on the horizon for this stuff. I think we're still early on for especially the blow up of the potential for oral peptide use. There's just not a lot of great data yet. I think we'll get there. We're studying this like crazy. I mean, there's another great article I'll just share with you here close to the wrap here. It's from 2024. It's from a journal called Expert Opinion in Drug Delivery. It's called Challenges and Opportunities in Delivering Oral Peptides and Proteins. And it's basically the same kinds of stuff we were talking about with respect to that other article. And there, I'm just going to say their conclusion, I'll just read it. Although most current studies on oral peptide delivery rely on in vitro and in vivo animal data, in other words, they haven't just been studied that much in humans. It says the safety and limitations of this in humans remains uncertain. The shortage of clinical data limits the development of new or alternative strategies. So right now, there's a significant challenge still to these oral deliveries of these peptides. And there's a lot of innovation, a lot of new strategies, but just not quite there yet. So I would say for now, save your money, grab my book, and that's cheaper than a bottle of supplements of almost any kind from any company. I mean, grab my book, Preventable 5 Powerful Practices to Avoid Disease and Build Unshakable Health. Start utilizing those 5 approaches that I detail out pretty succinctly and specifically in the book each and every day. Every one of them is basically free. Those tools and techniques I described don't cost any money, and they are powerful. And don't forget what I think just maybe, we'll see. I think it'll be interesting if some studies were to actually look at this. I'll call it a vitamin because I love to just kind of call these things vitamins. It's kind of fun. Vitamin C for connection, how powerful that may be in not only enhancing your day-to-day enjoyment and fulfillment of your life, but also your longevity. I really feel like that vitamin, if you will, C for connection, is one of the, if not the most powerful things that we can each do. It's available to all of us to connect with our fellow humans, right? Our Homo sapien colleagues and friends and family, to connect with them and just share the love, spread the joy. And I really feel like that's one of the most effective tools ever. Just going to go ahead and drop the mic right in front of you. But anyway, if you have questions about peptides, please reach out to me. Dr. Thomas Hemingway, Dr. Thomas Hemingway on Instagram, Thomas Hemingway MD on Facebook, my website, thomashemingway.com. Lots of super exciting stuff in the works, including my new concierge practice that's opening up in a couple of weeks. We also have new programs that are available. Lots of new stuff. I'm going to be doing an upcoming webinar for free on some topics such as these: how to increase our energy, our performance, going from fatigued to living full out. That's coming up real soon. So keep your eyeballs on that. In the near future, just keep following me over there on Insta or Facebook, wherever you do this. And don't forget to share, and like, share this episode with a friend, a family, and yeah, it'll be awesome. And so thank you in advance for listening, for taking your time to just share with me this exciting stuff with respect to peptides. There's so much out there. There's so much up and coming, and it's exciting. It just turns me on to learn all this stuff, share it with you, to utilize it in my life. Also, I'll be utilizing some of these with patients as well, because there's proven techniques and so much cool stuff out there. So until next time, thank you in advance for following me, for dropping a review over there on Apple, or rating this on Spotify, or grabbing a book on Amazon, still there. And make sure you click the little 5-star over on Amazon. Drop me a quick review. I'd love to see it. Once we reach 50, this thing will be shared more with the general public. We're very close to that. And I'm just going to say, if you do that over there on Amazon, or drop me a review over there on Apple, screenshot it, message me, share it with me, and there's a pretty good chance I'll send you a free copy of my book. I've already done that a couple times in the last few weeks because I love sharing the love, and I would love for you to be giving this out to friends, family in the upcoming holiday season. It's just life-changing stuff, and it's accessible, it's free. These tools are powerful. They have helped me so much in my life, and I just want to share it and share it out, because as you know, my goal is to not only surf beyond 100, be the first surfer to continue to surf beyond 100, but to also help prevent 100 million premature deaths from preventable cause. Until next time, aloha. Thanks for watching, and make sure to like, subscribe, and share with a friend. These podcasts take hours of research, and taking just 2 seconds of your life to hit the like, subscribe, and share button will help a ton and get this word out to help more and more people. Thanks in advance. Mahalo and aloha.